That's great. Well, first of all, welcome and good afternoon. Very pleased to be introducing Julian Harrap. Practice has won multiple RIBA awards and the 2011 European Prize for Contemporary Architecture, the Mies van der Rohe Award. He's perhaps best known for his contribution to the News Museum in Berlin, which was delivered in partnership with David Chipperfield Architects and was what the Mies van der Rohe Award was awarded for. The building was designed by Frederick August Schulter in 1855 and suffered severe damage during World War II, after which it was left as an abandoned bomb site. Emergency measures to secure the structure were only taken in the 1980s. Painstaking restoration work got underway in 2003. The building facade and interiors were carefully preserved. The scars of war were not patched over, but rather incorporated into the restoration of the building. What has emerged is a restored historic building that is also an outstanding modern museum. The architect thus managed to lend this extraordinary building and former ruin a unique and wholly authentic splendour. We are delighted to welcome Julian to talk about this and other projects, and importantly to share his philosophy on conservation architecture. So I would like to welcome you, Julian.
Thank you very much, Chairman. What a delight it is to join you, the Royal Society of Ulster Architects, on the occasion of the European Heritage Open Days 2020. I want to consider archive, analysis, and architecture. And I start where I started, with my dear friend Jim Sterling. Here you'll see him as a young man standing by columns which you might recognize later on. He was a modernist, a ruthless modernist, but at the same time his admiration for Schinkel and Stuller was profound. And I went to Berlin with him to meet Ungers, to talk about his housing schemes, as well as the historic architecture by Schinkel. Next, please. And we talk about archives, and the practice is absolutely dependent on three brilliant people. On the left, Helen Dorey from the Soane Museum, and as you see her standing in front of some wallpaper which Soane put on the walls in 1821. And we have the receipt in the museum for that purchase of wallpaper. That leads you to an opportunity at the Soane to do things you would never ever be able to do elsewhere. And then in the centre, Oliver Bradbury, who is our historian at the present time and has been working with us on the Museum of London. And then to the right, Wendy Hitchmo, Dr. Wendy Hitchmo, who worked with us on the King's Cross scheme with Foster's, north of King's Cross, and also at Charleston, the Bloomsbury Sets country farm in Sussex. Next. And here I am back with Jim. So I took over the making of a model from Michael Wilford of the history faculty and saw it through construction. And in the foreground, you see my tables. Nobody can ever claim real authorship for anything because it's always a group effort. The man who kilned the beach for us, who laminated it in these curves, the man called, I think, Mr. Best, who designed the light fittings with us, with all the gear below the raised section in the centre. My contribution, perhaps slight as it is, was to bring the quadrant curve of the library into the side chamber. And so what we agreed was that the table should link those two spaces. Next, please. And now we go to the Soane as I started with it 30 years ago. And Dorothy Stroud and John Summerson had done a wonderful job after the war of repopulating the museum with all its collections, which had been put in a Welsh mine for safety. And theirs was the task of trying to put together all the documentation lodged with government in 1837 when Soane died, and to calibrate that documentation with the actual archives, the actual artifacts which had come from the mine. We had the task of starting a program of room by room thinking about how Soane had seen his interiors and how he'd actually built a whole philosophy of architecture in 3 tiny Georgian houses on Lincoln's Inn Fields. Next, please. Here on the right is the model room restored with the wallpaper that you saw behind Helen's shoulder and the limed floorboards, which were general to Soane's interiors. The model frame, again, we had the receipts for it, and in looking at those, we realized that not only were the collection of artifacts changed, but the frame had actually been reduced in size, and so we were able to add the 2 end bays and understand how Soane has seen it as a grand piece of architecture as well as a model stand. And on the left, I just thought I would touch on some of the use of glass by Soane. And here you see a convex mirror where he's distorting reality. And part of the story of the way he organizes his collections within the house is to take you into a Gothic underworld where reality is distorted, and using mirrors like this relates perhaps to Anish Kapoor's house that we worked on at the end of the terrace. Next, please. Soane was known for his use of light, and on the left-hand side is one of his light shafts, which was totally obscured and built over in the period from 1850 to 1940, when curators had felt fairly free to interfere with his original very precise ordered conjunction of architecture and artifacts. So this is a light shaft which starts on the roof, comes through a blind story, and then to the room below at second floor in the museum. And on the right, you see another game he's playing that, if you look at the central portrait of the figure below the skylight, you'll see that there is the image occurring on either side. In other words, reality and image, and if you like rather like a country house borrowing the adjoining landscape to flatter its prominence. Next, please. And so we go to Berlin, where the Prussian emperor, he commissioned Gili to try to create an image of the Athens of the North, so that the emperor could bring those collections that were accumulating from Greece and Egypt and Mesopotamia and display them as a symbol of his power and knowledge. And so this was the inspiration for what became Museum Island in central Berlin, the boundary between east and west at some points. At other points, Unter den Linden leads from the Central Park in Berlin down to the palace and to Lustgarten. Next, please. And this, the primary exhibit, it's rather rude to say it, but it's described as the 20-minute visit object. It is that object which anybody coming to Berlin to look at its collections has to see. It's Nefertiti, and this is the product of a workshop where this idealized head, not a natural reproduction of a person, but an idealized vision of an Egyptian goddess, they were produced as symbols of power throughout the empire. Next, please. And Schinkel and Stüller knew they had to build a building, a multi-story building, because of the constraint of Museum Island in the middle of the Spree. They had a small floor plate. And so they were planning to build the first multi-story museum in the world. And that indeed is what the Neues Museum is. And what did they do? They came to Manchester to look at the mills, and this is Schinkel's sketch of the mills in Manchester, where my family comes from, curiously enough. And they went to visit Soane, and they talked to him about the hollow pots that he was using at the Bank of England at that time. And Schinkel and Stüller utilized those because when they built the walls of the museum in the middle of the river, it sank by 400 millimeters, just over 18 inches. And that was because of the timber foundations going into soft mud. And so they were looking for a very lightweight form of constructing the floors. And they used these hollow pots, which we were able to reproduce and then to repair as part of the museum scheme. Next, please. So this is the Altars Museum, the first museum designed by Schinkel, and then Stüller does the Neues Museum behind. In the distance beyond the fountain is the Schloss, the King's Palace. In the foreground is an artillery ground so that he can display his power to the populace, and then a pleasure garden, and this wonderful staircase, which is inside and outside. It's part of the landscape of the square, but it also invades the building so that you ascend without the inhibition of doors to come to the general circulation from which the galleries open. Now enclosed by the GDR in a glass envelope, but it makes no difference to the conception of Schinkel, a magnificent one, which is carried on in the external and internal staircases on Museum Island, where the National Gallery and the Neues Museum link together. Next. And what a sad sight. This is the Treppenhalle, and you can see the fragment of the staircase surviving with marble treads and risers. And in the center, there should be a model of the Erechtheion, which was demolished because, as Schinkel and Stüller conceded, that was the epitome of the Greek culture which they intended to commemorate, together with Egyptian and Abyssinian collections as well. It's a three-story museum. The upper flight, straight ahead of us where the window is a platform from which a series of galleries circulate around two courtyards. The same at the middle floor, which we're looking at, and then below us, the ground floor has the same plan form. So it's a figure of 8 around two courtyards. And the Mr. Sumner and Mr. Henson need a special mention for the way in which, when the GDR was the custodian of this ruin, they went and collected with the small resources they had, all the fragments which had collapsed into the lower levels of the museum. These are, you might recognize, similar to the columns behind Jim in the original photograph. But this was a wonderful reservoir for us to go and catalogue, analyse, and consider how it might be relocated within the new restored museum. Next, please. And so this is the little model that we made, and it shows the two courtyards either side of the central internal staircase. And the white areas are the areas which were totally demolished by bombing. So the RAF came in from the lower left. They dropped bombs on the southeast risalit, the corner structure, which is white compared with the timber of the remaining shell. And then beyond, the Greek courtyard was also demolished almost entirely. So that gave us a framework to think about where we had opportunities for repair, restoration, reconstruction on the documentary base of both artifacts and archive, and where there were opportunities for new but not overriding introductions of new work. Next, please. And I just wanted to show this diagram because it shows the language which seemed somehow new in 1997. It was this new stuff called Photoshop. At the bottom, you see the ruined wall. And if we take the bay, the second one in from the left, you can see an angry red brickwork reconstruction of a lacuna or gap. And that was what the GDR did in order to stabilize the ruin, while in 1982, they underpinned the whole building, because by that time the timber piles were decayed and continuing movement was in hand following the initial settlement. And the timber piles had gone down about 38 feet into the mud. But this angry red brickwork was an engineer's solution, an engineering solution where sand and cement and an engineering brick had been inserted in soft lime brickwork, of which the whole building was constructed. And so on the top, you see that what we have done is we've replaced the engineering brick with second-hand bricks and lime mortar. And you can also see that there, below the niches are 4 little slots, and that's part of the original heating system for the museum, which we retained. And so in our proposals for how we might mend the museum, we're re-establishing the flexibility and stability of the fabric, but also looking for all those services which Struller had put in. He put in shafts for ventilation, and we were able to use those for wiring electrical distribution. And we dug a trench all the way around the basement of the whole building, so that all the service distribution was outside the building. And then we put services on the roof so you could feed up and feed down to avoid major services throughout the historic structure. Next, please. And in Germany, everything has to be in order. And here I am dressed up on the right, reporting to the superior to say that, yes, everything is in order. And this cartoon is to prompt the idea that we had to obtain DIN standards for second-hand materials. We were told initially we couldn't use second-hand brick, but I knew there were millions of second-hand bricks available in a demolished city like Berlin. And having brought the architects to London, where we sorted second-hand bricks, they were convinced that we could go back to the authorities and do prototyping to demonstrate that second-hand bricks could be selected to form to DIN standard. And that was one of the real collaborations throughout the project. Next, please. And the team. And so to my right is, of course, David, and the two of us had sat in Agar Road for many nights, working with, on our right, on David's right, Martin, and then on my left, Sasha, and then on the left, Dr. Haspel. And he's down with us because he is the historic buildings representative of the city of Berlin. And they had a 40-strong team of historic buildings planners, architects, and conservators who were there not only to protect the interests of the city in what we did, but also to collaborate with us and support us throughout. The one person missing there, and it's such a shame, is Eva Schad, who was the partner in Chipperfield Berlin office, with whom I've had a most wonderful relationship going back 30 years. Something I really treasure. Next, please. We've looked at Berlin destroyed in wartime, and this is where the warplanes were made. This is the Farnborough Defence Research Establishment, and in Britain, all the research for new planes was done through initially through the services, and these establishments had gone on from the 1900s until the 1970s, when Mrs. Thatcher said they should be privatized. And so Kinetic, privatized company, was spun off, and this site was a brownfield site awaiting redevelopment. And the English Heritage listed some of the buildings because they were of interest. And Sir Nigel Mobbs asked us to look at all the buildings on the site, 120 of them, to assess their value, to measure them, record them, do an archive research, and therefore collaborate with the Fast Air Services Trust, the local museum in the bottom of the picture by the pine trees, to ensure a record instead of just wholesale demolition, as perhaps one might say happened on the Clyde. Here, we had some outstanding buildings. Next, please. And they were used to design these aircraft. So here we go on part of the journey from a biplane to a modern fighter. But below the biplane, there really should be kites and airships. And then between the biplane and the fighter, there should be the Spitfire. And above the fighter, there should be Concorde. And so we have this great story of the evolution of an industry on one side. Next, please. And here we are with the supersonic tunnel being built in 1943 during the war on the left-hand side. And oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had these tripod cranes? They're just so beautiful as objects. I know tower cranes can also be appealing, but I do love the tripod crane. Below the jib of the crane, where there is the wheels dropping the load line to the hook, you'll see the subsonic building, and it's a 3-story building, and the lower part is the return wind tunnel. And that is a circulating donut of air, which provides on the right-hand side a test chamber where the great fan draws laminar flow air past the hanging model aircraft. And it's hanging because you don't have computer balances in these days, but you have the sort of balance that you might have in a kitchen to weigh out flour. It's a cantilever balance mechanism, and that's why the plane is hanging upside down. And then you see around the propeller these perforations of this ferro cement bell, which takes out the turbulence of the flow as it approaches the propeller. On the left, you see the supersonic test facility with the sting, this element protruding from the central wing, and it's on that the model of Concorde was laid and researched and refined. And then the slots on the outside are to allow air to escape from the concentrated chamber, again to preserve laminar flow. And behind is this massive ducted fan, which was rated at 20,000 horsepower, and it could only operate at night because when they started it up, it closed down all the electricity in the town of Farnborough because of its draw on the grid. On the right-hand side, you can see the low level propeller, and here you see in the colour the wonderful mahogany blades, and in the foreground these ferro cement fins which are twisted to take the rotation out of the donut of air surrounding the lower portion of the building. Next, please. And all these buildings were built of concrete of different ages and different qualities. On the left, we've taken a slice. So what we're doing is we're saying, well, what's the aggregate, where it's come from? And of course, it was mined locally. So it's an as-dug aggregate. And so if we're repairing aggregates, we've got to be aware of the materiality of the concrete. And on the right, you can see under the microscope the effect of carbonation, this decay of concrete, which is an aspect we have to deal with. Next, please. And so here we are on the left, we've dug out the rusting reinforcement, and what we're doing is trial repairs using sharp sand with the latons sponged off. And then on the right, we have another example, and we have a repair which in the middle sentence, Judy Allen in the office is writing, there is a build-up of repair mortar around the edge of the repair, which should be sponged off or wire brushed while still green. In other words, that assessment, that collaboration with the man on the tools is essential to try to get a substrate repair of boarded shuttered concrete, where the cultural entity is really in the shuttering rather than necessarily the concrete. And then on the right, you're getting an anti-carbonation glaze. It's a lasure rather than being just repainting your tower blocks in white anti-carbonation paint. Next, please. And within the central area, we were threatened with a conservation area designation unless we took responsibility for the buildings to remain, the listed wind tunnels. And so this is our research into paint colours of camouflage during the war. And here you can see that we have applied that to the central block, the most valuable block containing the flask where the wind was running at Mach 2 through the central test facility. Next, please. We've also, if you look at the shadow of the rainwater pipe and on the central of the picture, you can see that it was built in 1943, it was built in a rush, and actually the rainwater pipe is straight and it's the concrete which has this undulation. The crittle windows have been not thrown away, but taken out and shot blasted, and the sheet glass retained so that we can put back a material which gives the reflectance that one might expect before float glass is invented. The box gutters are of aluminium. We replaced cast iron, which both looked heavy and also, we thought, diminished the elegance of this projecting concrete eaves detail. Another detail where we've manipulated the design and just not done like for like is the swan neck connection from the top of the cast iron gutter to the aluminium gutter. Elsewhere, we've chosen tones which harmonize with the rear elevation. I've lost my vision. I don't know whether we can restore that. Thank you. Could we go to the next, please? Besides concrete, there was amazing early steel. And when I say early steel, this is 1911. So wrought iron is running up to the 1880s. And then you get this transition period where carbon's being added to wrought iron in various ways and with various levels of success to give us a range of iron-based alloys with which we're familiar today. And of course, stainless steel and nickel are our everyday material. We had two listed buildings which contained part of an earlier structure. And this is part of the top of a mobile airship hangar. You have the rivets, they're 3/4 inch rivets, hot riveted sections of early steel, triangulated and formed into arch form. So we had to get listed building consent to knock down two listed buildings, and I'll tell you what the subsequent stories was. Next, please. That structure, which we saw in the foundry building, was the upper portion of this mobile airship hangar. So here it is, clad in what it's lovely to say is probably Ulster flax canvas, because we know it's flax canvas, and where else could it come from but the wonderful Principality of Ulster. The doors at the end are just to close off the enclosure while an airship is being worked on, perhaps having a new gondola, perhaps having new engines or fabric repair. But the idea of this was that it was mobile. So it was taken down by the Royal Engineers. It was loaded onto 54 railway wagons. It was then taken by rail to Suffolk, and the airship was gassed up and then sent across to Belgium to observe the positions of enemy soldiers from an altitude which was safe to observe from. Photographs were brought back, and then instructions were issued to the Allied forces on the continent. Next, please. And this is our reconstruction of the two portions we salvaged from the airship hangar. The upper ones you recognize, the lower ones came from another building where they'd served as a secondary purpose. And this recycling of materials is absolutely wonderful to observe, not as a modern fad, but as something which has gone on forever. We had here to provide a stable structure, so we've done a little system of piled foundations with exposed aggregate shoes, as we describe them, then a bench with underlighting, and then these braces with the lower portion protected by a tube for safety reasons, so that the structure can be used for the displaying of banners, and you can erect tents inside it, temporary structures, and it can serve as an advertising element of the Slough Business Park here at Farnborough to the biannual aerospace exhibition, which takes place on the south side of the airfield. Next, please. And it wasn't all there. All these purlins, which we describe as spinnaker poles, and I think indeed they were made of timber, and it may well be that's why they disappeared. And all the diagonal wiring, the braces, which had been rope, has long since gone. We had the task of how do we complement the existing fabric with a new intervention, which is in the spirit of what had been lost. And so we used wires with telluric terminals, and we could adjust those so that each one of the slightly distorted hairpins could be brought into a manner of joint stability. And the spinnaker poles, we couldn't afford to taper them, and so there's a central cylinder with two cones at each end, and we had 2 or 3 prototypes made and then walked 100 yards away and then 150 yards away to see whether the eye would actually make them appear like the totally tapered spinnaker poles that we were seeking to replicate. Next, please. And so this is the definition of the central area with all the listed and unlisted buildings within it, which the County Council had threatened would be listed unless we took care of these buildings. Sir Nigel Mobbs took this as a social responsibility, and his company, Slough Estates, invested the money to make this into a civic space at the heart of a vibrant business park and housing area just to the south of Farnborough. And now we travel to a different situation where we have a university town, Leiden in Holland, and we're going to be talking about the Lachenhalle Museum, which is a wool guild museum starting in 1640, and it had a number of phases of expansion. In the late 19th century, it had a new gallery in the garden, and then in the early 20th century, it had a very substantial extension on the east side. And so you had a whole sequence of dates of construction which needed appraising and agglomerating within the existing structure, and also the need for a new extension. One might have thought of doing a basement extension, but that was out of the question because on the right you have a canal, and the difficulties they've had in Berlin building the new Simon building with the adjacent river was not to be replicated on this site. Next, please. And so in the early 70s, a simple tent had been incorporated in the central courtyard where the wool, English wool, had been brought for weaving and dyeing with indigo. And it provided a perfectly decent set of accommodation for the museum. But it was recognized that the main building itself was somewhat diminished by this fading plastic platform. You notice that on the building, the wing behind, the west wing, you see the enrichment of carved fruit and swags. And this is all Silesian sandstone. And you see it here painted white. So I'd like you to observe that when we come to the the next photograph. But what I want to say is that our resolve with the museum and with our colleagues at Happel, Cornelius and Reitven, we were determined to re-establish this courtyard. Next, please. And so we start at the canal where the wool was unloaded, and we're looking into the courtyard where we've taken away the roof, which had served perfectly adequately for 30 years, but which had diminished the setting and the architectural expression of the Guild Wool Hall. You'll see that door again later on, but let's go into the courtyard. Next, please. And here you see the restored pavement relating geometrically to the building, and the great windows which light the wool hall, where the quality of the cloth was assessed for character and suitability of certification in grades, and also the judgment made as to the impact of the indigo on the cloth. Was it to the quality which the guild would certify with a lead seal? And then it was exported all over the world. And there's a wonderful map inside the museum of the places to which it's exporting. It's a world map with little repositories of cloth going from this building everywhere by sailing ship. You can just see the Silesian sandstone, which I've mentioned when we were looking through the perspex. It's now harmonious with the stone of the building itself because we've cleaned it to take off all the paint, and sandstone combines with the corrosive elements in the atmosphere, smoke and that sort of pollutant, to actually form a skin over the whole of the stone surface. And we had much debate with the museum as to what to do. We tried experiments in tiny samples of cleaning it, but it was absolutely clear that it damaged the stone. And so what we've done is a lasure wash over that to establish the natural color and therefore the architectural harmony of the elevation without painting it white. Next, please. So we come inside the museum. The floor above with its joists is original. And then the great beams that go across had been replaced in steel. So we enclosed them in timber to harmonize them with the original floor and boarding above. And then the furniture designed by Ninka, Florence and Paul. It provides on the right-hand side for the sale of wool cloth, and beyond that, ticketing and so on. The floor should have been timber, but it would have been too dark, so we've used a polished concrete, reflecting some of our floors in the Neues Museum. Next, please. And here's the lovely door on the right-hand side. It's a 1640s flush door. And you see on the left this beautiful little drawing of 1552, and it shows the way in which a great slab of timber is made, and then the door is cut out of it, it's hinged and locked. Next, please. This is the collection behind, and one of the extensions. Next, please. And the new building, which takes the pitch of the local terrace, and then it, in spatial terms, occupies a skyline which was occupied by the weaving sheds within the town. Next, please. We come on quickly to the Neues Museum, to the Museum of London. In the foreground is the General Market, and I'm just going to talk about the poultry market beyond. So let's quickly go on to this wonderful 1962 building where you have a central shell, which is 225 feet by 136, and it's only 85 millimeters thick. Next, please. Here are our chaps, engineers working under Jack Zunz in 1962 with their hard hats, their high vis and their safety boots. Next, please. This is the critical issue of post-tensioning the arched lunette beam on either side. And you can see the calibration dial on the ram, which is pulling the wires to tension the wire within the concrete. And then a wonderfully archaic telephone connected by a wire to a manhole in the street is perhaps talking to Jack Zunz as to whether they should add another 2 tons. The 3 characters on the periphery obviously attending to what is being said. Next, please. And this is the pouring of the dome with the 85 millimeter thick shell. Next, please. And this is what it looks like from the inside with these decayed fiberglass roof lights, which give a wonderful warm light to the interior. And it's a handkerchief dome, but rather than Bryn Mawr, which springs structurally from the corner, this one is supported by columns within the lunettes using the same glazing as Jim Sterling did on the engineering building at Leicester. Next, please. The roof was made with soft copper, and that soft copper had been laid in rather ambitiously long lengths, and you can see at the top the failure through cracking hardening. And so we've had to redetail it in semi-hard copper so that we can replicate the standing seams and the detailing of the original building. Next, please. And in order to, the whole roof can move around the fixed roof light, which is a concrete ring in the shell, we've invented this concertina so that the whole welted roof is free to float and move without producing the cracking which you saw on the original. And this is Lockhart's Coker Rooms, and in the general market we were able to come upon in our exploration what we believe to be the last surviving Lockhart's Coker Rooms. Coker Rooms are part of the temperance movement in the late 19th century, and here you can see how the market had been designed to operate with horses and carts. And next, please. These are the gentlemen who were in danger of going to work, working hard through the night, and then going to the pub and causing a social nuisance in the whole area. And so in order to encourage them away from the drink, next please, they were issued with these tokens by Lockhart's and by the temperance movement, sponsored by the great Quaker families of the Cadburys and the Frys and the Courtholds. Next, please. So here is the advert for the alternative to going to the pub. And this is such a rare survival that the museum, we hope, will be able to find a proper place for it within the new museum. Next, please. Internally, the temperance saloon at first floor level is fascinating with these sub-Voisey tiles, which we've had identified as by Pilkingtons, designed at the same time as Voisey was about. We can't prove the provenance, but they have that connection. And we have the opportunity to keep one of the great chambers, which is tiled throughout. And it's not just this dado, which is decorative, but next we have the frieze below the cornice. And as you see above that, you can see that we have an iron framed floor. It's a pot floor with multiple layers of backed up plaster to cover over settlement and so on. So the fragility of the structure on which these tiles are attached is established. Next. One of the fascinating things about the general market was that it was one of the first places in the country where electric lighting was displayed. And this is Edson, who generates electricity in a local electrical generating plant and lights the market in 1921. And in researching and reading his specification, he used ribbed glass for the light shades. And this ribbed glass was designed to break the glare of the filament, but also the glass had silver and gold foil applied to it so that it enriched the colour of the carcasses, which were the meat trade produce. We've now rescued not some of these original ones, but some of the secondary scheme of electric lighting, and I hope that we'll have those repaired and incorporated in the new museum. Next, please. And then we're nearly ending. I'd like to dedicate this little talk to my friend Derek Jarman, with whom I was able and enjoyed sharing a flat in Abbey Road in West Hampstead. We had many arguments, but it would have been a joy if I could have told him about the things that I've just described to you. Next, please. And so this is his cottage, and his memory is secured with the new transfer of ownership to the Arts Fund. I would have argued with him about the yellow. It's a bit too acid. He would have told me he found a pot of paint. I would have said, why did he leave the white painted windows? Why didn't he paint them grey or black? And he would have said, Julian, that was just to annoy you. Next, please. And so these are the archives which relate to those projects that I've skated through today. Thank you so much for your patience in listening to this little presentation. Thank you.
Julian, thank you so much for your talk. I think it's given everybody listening a lot to consider. And rather than me ask the questions that are in my mind, I'd like to open it up to everybody who is listening. If you would like to use the little raise your hand icon, which you'll see probably at the top of your screen, and if you raise your hand, I'll call your name out, and then if you just remember to turn on your sound and your camera before asking your question. So whilst I wait for the, oh, there we go, James Hamilton, if you want to go ahead.
Hi everyone, can everyone see and hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Well, firstly, thank you very much for putting this together. It's a wonderful lecture during this time, and seems to work quite well. But a question for Julian. I was always interested in the placement of Michelangelo's Tonda at the top of the stairs at the Royal Academy. And I think you were involved with Foster and Partners at that stage, potentially, in the Sackler Gallery, Sackler Extension. It drew a lot of observation and potential criticism for placing it in that location. And I've always wondered why it was there. It's a very sort of secondary space. Just wondered your thoughts on that.
Thank you so much for the question. You take me back. There comes a time when you're dealing with a client, you've worked through a project, you've selected how the circulation shall work, how the Burlington House shall speak to the new exhibition galleries in the garden, as it was, Burlington House. You make some representation of the two elevations talking to one another. You then have the Penthorne galleries on the top, which are converted to the Sackler galleries, and you have this armature of circulation, which is lit with the same sort of frosted glass that we've seen elsewhere earlier on. And then the president says, what about the Tondo? In other words, you have a project which has a momentum of itself, and as it evolves, so people see how wonderful it is, and we are neglecting the Tondo. It's inadequately lit at the moment, and indeed it was. And so it's a late comer to the brief, and we think, oh my goodness, how can we find a way in which it can be displayed? And so, in a sense, I daren't almost say this in public, but it was a leftover space that became occupied. And I've worked with David Chipperfield recently on the current scheme on 6 Burlington Gardens. And as part of that, we did another scheme to come up to the west of Burlington House and actually reposition the Tondo in a new setting with a new axis so that it had perhaps a better setting. But just finally, I would say, exactly the same thing happened in 6 Burlington Gardens, where they took all the architectural casts from the School of Architecture in the art school in the ground floor, and they said, well, look, these are wonderful, and so they get displayed on the first floor of 6 Burlington Gardens just as you enter the new lecture theatre. And so that is my story of how one is an architect responding to clients' developing and evolving enthusiasm.
Great, thank you very much. Very interesting. Thank you.
So do we have any other hands going up? In the meantime, I've got a question here, Julian, from Ben. It says, hi, Julian. I'm wondering if you or David formed a critical view of the Prussian King Wilhelm as a colonialist plundering approach. Does a post-reunification restoration of the Neues come alongside a reconsideration of its symbolism and or its relationship to the state? So if you can make sense of that.
No, he has grasped at my conscience, because one of my first expeditions was into the vaults of the Pergamon Museum, and I just was astonished at the fantastic collection of material which was in the reserve collection. And it applies to the Museum of London. The Museum of London has 7 million objects. Many of them will have come from the trading of the City of London and its empire, where Horace Jones, the designer of the Smithfield Market, he also designed Tower Bridge. So he designed the gateway to the empire. All that treasure came into the Pool of London and then came to enrich the city. And it's exactly the same in Berlin. We have to live with our history. And that's why when we were dealing with Farnborough, that it was, we had a poisoned site. We had a site which was saturated with petrochemicals. We had to steam it all out. We had mercury. We had a thermonuclear reactor, which we were not engaged with, but to actually deal with that sort of collection is part of the conservation architect's menu, if you like. And therefore, yes, I'm absolutely convinced about the issue of repatriation, and it is something which all museums universally will have to address. And so I take the point. It's in my bones, and it leads to the way in which one is accountable for the work of others before one. One has a responsibility to them, and one has a responsibility to the culture of the society with whom you work. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian, for that very fulsome response. And it's interesting that immediately it's clearly something that has been in your mind. I'm just conscious of the time, but I think there is time for another question. Just we're only a few minutes past 2. If anybody wants to take this last opportunity. No hands immediately going up. So Julian, I would just like to thank you on behalf of everybody who has been here today listening for participating in the European Heritage Open Day in Northern Ireland here. It's been a very, very different European Heritage Open Day in 2020, but we were very keen as RSUA to try and find a way to be actively involved, and yeah, we are so delighted that you accepted our invitation to speak today. And rather than just me tell you what I thought of your thing, I'm just going to read out some of the comments. Many thanks, great, fantastic presentation, brilliant, superb talk, really interesting, great format, utterly brilliant. Thank you, Julian, very interesting. Thank you, Julian. So that's just a very quick summary of some of the comments coming through. And just to wrap up, from the Royal Society of Ulster Architects, our heartfelt thanks for your contribution today.
Thank you so much. It's really been a delight. And I thank Chris, who's helped me with the buttons.
Thanks to Chris too.
Thank you.
I'll be in touch, Julian, okay?
Bye-bye.